won the Battle of Clontarf? At first sight, this video may seem to ask a stupid question. After all, it has been drummed into school children in Ireland for more than a century, or even longer, that the Battle of Clontarf was a battle between the Irish under Brian Boru and the Vikings. Brian Boru won the battle and shattered Viking power in Ireland forever. He may have died, a martyr's death in some accounts, but he won the battle. Although this traditional account has been questioned in academic circles for decades, in popular history it remains strong. Indeed, this can be seen by the numerous YouTube videos supposedly giving the real account of the battle. Yet, few of these, if any, critically analyze the traditional version handed down. The title of this video is provocative. After all, everyone knows that Brian Boru won the Battle of Clontarf. But what victory was this in which he, his son and heir, and grandson were killed, and which resulted in Brian's family losing the High Kingship or the Kingship of Tara? What victory was this when the Norse king remained in power in Dublin after the battle? And indeed, the Norse Kingship of Dublin would last until it was overthrown by the Normans. What victory was this which left the Kingship of Tara as something to be fought over, and which would constantly change hands until the Norman invasion? Yet, we can also point out that while Sitric Silkbeard, King of Norse Dublin, may have survived the battle, the possibility of a new wave of attacks on Ireland, or indeed a new invasion by Norse forces from the Orkneys or elsewhere, ended with the battle. It is not impossible that had the forces of the King of Dublin and the King of Leinster won at Clontarf, a much stronger Norse kingdom would have emerged in Ireland. In a way, it is easier to say who lost the battle than who won it. One way this can be done is by listing those killed in the battle. These include Sigurd, Jarl of Orkney, as well as other Norse leaders and soldiers from outside Ireland. Also among the dead was Máel Mórda King of Leinster, alias Sitric in the latter's rebellion against Brian Boru, as well as numerous other Gaelic and Norse lords. Brian's dynastic plans were also destroyed by his death and that of his heir Mórda and grandson Turlough. Perhaps the greatest loser was the traditional political system of Gaelic Ireland. Prior to Brian Boru, the Kingship of Tara had alternated between the northern and southern Néill. Several of the leading lords from both branches had made attempts to establish a stronger central authority. However, bad luck and Norse defeats prevented this. Brian Boru smashed the Néill hegemony over the Kingship of Tara, but his death prevented him from establishing a new system in its place. This meant that the High Kingship would become a political football in the aftermath of the battle. It would be held by various kings and was largely won by violence rather than being inherited. This unstable situation would continue until the Norman invasion. Rather than being a battle of Irish against Vikings, Clontarf was a battle between armies that were both composed of Norse and Gaelic soldiers. Though the Leinster-Dublin army probably had more Norse from outside Ireland. Despite the spin put on the battle, beginning around 100 years later with the Cogad Gael Regal, the battle was not between Irish and Vikings. It was between Brian Boru and the kings of Dublin and Leinster. Both the latter had previously accepted Brian's rule or overlordship, but had rebelled against him in 1012. This was something common in Gaelic politics. Also increasingly common in Gaelic politics was the incorporation of Norse cities and kingdoms in the Gaelic political system. Indeed, F.J. Byrne argued in his seminal work Irish Kings and High Kings, originally published in the 1970s, that the defeat of the Vikings by the northern Néill, particularly the Cenel-Owen, led to the latter's long-term economic decline, as they were unable to benefit from the advantages of having a Norse city, and specifically the money that could be obtained from this. Furthermore, the Limerick Norse played an important role in Brian's military successes. with their ships allowing him to use the Shannon as a road, which allowed him to strike quickly against his enemy. It is also likely that Norse from Cork and Waterford were on Brian's side in the battle. Máel Sechnaill, king of Tara before Brian and leader of Clan Coleman, was also one of Brian's allies, but may not have been present at the battle. In some accounts he is said to have left the night before the battle due to a disagreement with Brian. Brian also had troops from Munster, including the Onocht, and from Connacht. It is also worth emphasising that the Norse from Ireland, the so-called Hiberno Norse, frequently intermarried with the Gaelic Irish. Indeed, Sitric Silkbeard is a striking example of this. His mother was Gaelic, the famous Gormley, while he was married to Slania, daughter of Brian Boru. Moreover, Máel Mórda, king of Leinster, was his uncle. Just to confuse the relationships further, Gormley was married to Brian Boru. The Hiberno Norse were thus well integrated into the Gaelic political system, as well as the Norse political network. At Clontarf, Brian was faced with an alliance between the Gaelic king of Leinster, Máel Mórda, and the Norse king of Dublin, Sitric Silkenbeard. Both related to him by marriage. He had subjected them to his rule years previously, but both believed that Brian's power was weakening. They had been reinforced by Norse from Orkney and the Isle of Man. Indeed, several authors, notably Etchingham, have emphasised the international importance of the battle, since Scandinavian politics, involving both Denmark and Norway, were part of the context of the battle. Also part of the context of the battle is the presence or the absence of the Néill. Brian Boru had ended their monopoly of the High Kingship, yet they were still among the most powerful political and military forces on the island. From the southern Néill, Máel Sechnaill had been king of Tara until he had been forced to acknowledge Brian as king. He had since fought for and alongside Brian. The sources are confusing about his presence at the battle. Some say he was there, others say that he withdrew because of an argument with Brian. He may well have been present, but not heavily involved in the fighting, as the lists of the dead in the annals do not include many of his followers. In relation to the northern Néill, Flaithbertach Néill, king of Kenalnoan, was absent. He stood outside the conflict, as there was no reason for him to fight. Indeed, he would benefit no matter who won. Finn Dwyer, from the excellent Irish History podcast, makes an important point here. He says that Clontarf had nothing to do with driving Vikings from Ireland. After all, Norse power had been declining in Ireland for a century or so. Rather, it had more to do with Brian's waning power. He was old, and in 1011 seems to have finally subdued all of Ireland. But his dominance was really weak. Things started to fall apart again in 10, 12 and 13, when Flaithbertach Néill attacked Ken O'Connell and Máel Sechnaill, thereby challenging Brian, and then Dublin and Leinster rebelled. All this points to the fact that the battle was being fought for Irish political reasons, albeit with a strong presence of soldiers from outside Ireland and an important international political context. It would not be the first defeat of the Norse in Ireland. They had suffered numerous defeats before. Indeed, Máel Sechnaill had imposed a crushing defeat on them in the 980 Battle of Tara, and Flaithbertach had exiled the Emir dynasty from Dublin in 902. In addition, in Ulster, the northern Néill had long destroyed the Norse settlements there. Just one more point before moving on to discuss the battle itself. The size of the battle. Clontarf was a very large battle, larger than was usual at the time. Contrary to what a certain type of military history implies, war consists of much more than battles. Indeed, in most periods of history, battles are rare, as raising an army is slow and costly, and rulers do not want to throw them away on the battlefield for nothing. In Clontarf, while Brian may have been past the peak of his power, he could still raise a large force in Munster, Connacht, and indeed elsewhere. For example, in the annals of the Four Masters, the death is mentioned of one Donal, son of Evin, son of Cainach, great steward of Maer in Alba. The latter points to the presence of numerous outsiders on both sides in the battle, something highlighted by Etchingham. On the north side were the forces of Dublin, the men of the King of Leinster, as well as large forces from the Orkneys and Hebrides, and the Isle of Man. Etchingham emphasises that Clontarf was exceptional due to its size. It was fought in a period when pitched battles were rare. He makes an interesting aside here, pointing out that in Ireland, Vikings lost between 2 and 3 times more battles than they won. In other words, successes like Island Bridge were rare. He also hints that the reason Clontarf was so large was due to external factors, notably the context of Scandinavian politics at the time. This includes the Danish subjugation of England in 1013 and conflicts between the rival Scandinavian power networks, basically Danish and Norwegian. In England, the Hebrides and the Isle of Man. Interestingly, Etchingham points out that the Danish axis had supported Brian for a long time. He even conjectures that, had Connaught been able to intervene in Clontarf, he would have supported Brian. However, due to the death of his father in early 1014 and his withdrawal from England, he was unable to. Sitric Silkbeard, he says, seems to have been part of the Norwegian sphere. The fact that he recruited soldiers from Man seems to illustrate that this had moved into the Norwegian sphere, as it had often been under Danish influence. Wotton takes a different position from Etchingham. He also stresses the importance of external influences on the battle, but, to the opposite of Etchingham, sees it as part of a possible Danish attack on Ireland. Though, in common with Etchingham, he sees the battle as part of a, quote, struggle for control over the Hiberno-Scandinavian kingdoms of the Irish Sea world, end quote. Now, let's move on to the battle itself. In 1012, the King of Leinster and the King of Dublin rebelled against Brian Boru. Brian quickly moved against Dublin, but despite besieging it, was unable to capture it. Since, in the previous decades, it had been captured various times, including by Brian itself, its defences must have been strengthened. In 1013, Brian was forced to give up the siege after 3 months or so and fall back. However, the following year, he attacked again. He had to, as Flaithbertach or Néill was in rebellion in Ulster and may have had his sights on the kingship of Tara. In the meantime, Sitric Silkbeard went in search of allies. Jarl Sigurd of Orkney and Brodir and others from the Isle of Man supported him. However, Máel Mórda failed to get the support of the Kinsel in Leinster or, more importantly, the northern Néill. When the forces of Sitric and Máel Mórda arrived, they seemed to have camped outside of Dublin, perhaps near Clontarf or Howth. Some were probably still at sea. Eventually, the entire army camped between Clontarf and Howth. Brian, when he arrived, also camped outside the city, perhaps in Kilmainham or in Tomar's Wood in Phibsborough. On the 23rd of April 1014, Good Friday, the two armies moved against each other. Findwire says they met east of Brian's camp and south of the Norse camp near Howth. The traditional account says the Norse fleet under Brodir landed near Clontarf Weir, which is near the mouth of the Tolka. It should be noted that most of this is conjecture. It is impossible to get facts about the battle. We do not know exactly where it was fought or the numbers on either side. All we can do is make estimates and conjectures. The two armies lined up against each other. Brian was too old to fight now. His army was led by his son and heir Murchada. Máel Mórda may have led the opposing side as Sitric remained in Dublin. It is probable that the composition of both sides was similar, made up of Gaelic, Norse and Hiberno-Norse troops. Probably both formed shield walls and moved against each other. Traditionally, the battle was fought between Castle Avenue and Seaview Avenue in Clontarf. These are only a few hundred metres apart, if even this. While the numbers may have been large, most of the troops, at least the heavy troops who formed the shield wall, would have been tightly packed. The battle is said to have lasted the whole day. Each side stood firm against the other, behind their shields, hacking and slashing at each other, trying to push their opponents back, hoping the others would tire first. Importantly, Máel Mórda's men had their backs to the sea, and the tide was coming in. This type of battle is ferocious. It is bloody, takes courage and strength. However, eventually something gives. One side breaks, and when they do, the collapse is normally swift and bloody. According to the traditional account, this happened at Clontarf. After hours of fighting, Máel Mórda's side broke and collapsed, and the battle turned into a bloody rout. The tide had come in, preventing many from escaping along the beach. Many are said to have drowned trying to do this. Some tried to get to Howth, others back to Dublin. Many of the latter are said to have been ambushed and killed at Dougall's Bridge, a crossing of the Talca. It should be noted that again this is supposition, based on accounts and traditions that emerged centuries after the battle, as the first annalistic accounts really just list the dead. The casualties on Brian's side were large. Brian himself was killed, supposedly by Brodir from Man, who was killed in turn. Also among the dead were his son and heir, Murchada, his grandson Turlough, his nephew Connig, and numerous nobles from Munster and Connacht. Probably his Norse supporters from Limerick and Waterford also suffered many losses. Casualties were equally bad on the opposing side. Máel Mórda was dead, as was Jarl Sigurd. This leads to questions about the outcome of the battle. Etchicum rightly raises doubts about Brian's victory. Indeed, Brian's forces did not act like a victorious army. They were so weak after the battle they were unable to capture Dublin. Instead of following up their supposed victory, they retreated back to Munster. Indeed, they were attacked in Ossory during their retreat. It is clear that Clontarf was a large and bloody battle. Both sides suffered badly. Indeed, the leaders on both sides were killed. The most important to survive were Sitric Silkbeard and Máel Sechnaill. Sitric remained in Dublin during the battle, while Máel Sechnaill's presence is questionable. However, this may be due to the rewriting of history a century later. Brian's forces may have defeated their opponents. However, the outcome of the battle also could have been a bloody stalemate. Moreover, the aftermath of a battle is as important as the battle itself. Jarl Sigurd may have had ideas of conquering Ireland, but he lay dead. So did Máel Mórda, Brian Boru, and his son. It would be Máel Sechnaill who would pick up the pieces and regain the high kingship, albeit a weakened one. Sitric could also said to be a victor. He would remain as King of Dublin. However, this victory came at a price for him. While this Norse kingdom had long been dominated by the Gaelic ones, this would now increasingly be the case, meaning that the autonomy of the Kingdom of Dublin was curbed. Due to the economic strength of the city, it would become key to the success of anyone wanting to be High King, and was thus always under the control of a Gaelic king. While the King of Dublin may have been weakened, the city itself became increasingly important, a prominence it never lost, ultimately becoming the capital of the state the Normans would establish in Ireland. The Battle of Clontarf was a large and bloody battle. It was important for various reasons, not least because of the numbers of kings and lords who died there. It is also a battle that cannot be understood solely in an Irish context. It had an international aspect. However, it has to be clearly understood that Brian Boru did not drive the Vikings from Ireland. The Norse had already been largely domesticated and were now part of the Gaelic political structure. Numerous Irish kings inflicted defeats on them. Clontarf may represent the destruction of a potential new type of Norse attack, but this should not be overemphasized. More than this, Clontarf represented a defeat of Brian Boru. After all, he had been killed, and the gCais left so weakened that they were knocked out of the political game at the national level for a generation or so, while, at a provincial level, they would face years of conflict with Connacht. Brian Boru, as Finn Dwyer says, did not unify Ireland, nor did he defeat the Vikings. Rather, he subjugated a large number of lords and kingdoms for a period. In Ulster, his rule as such was fleeting. However, a century or so later, one of his descendants would rise to prominence again. This led to the production of the Clogher Gael Regal. This was propaganda for the O'Brien dynasty. However, over various centuries, as shown by Clare Downham, it would be adapted for various political reasons. It would form the basis of the nationalist myths about the battle born in the Romantic Age. Myths that contain many errors, but which still remain popular. This video is aimed at encouraging people to read for themselves, to look at the sources and the secondary works, and to try to ignore the traditional version you have heard in school. After this, ask yourselves, who actually won the Battle of Clontarf? Was it Máel Sechnaill, or Sitric of Dublin, Flaithbertach or Néill? All of these gained politically from the death of Brian and the downfall of gCais. Or did no one actually win it? Was it a bloody stalemate? Or all of the above? In addition, while the latter is perhaps the most correct assertion, it is also the case that Brian Boru won the battle much later, a century or so after his death, with the production of the Clogher Gael Regal, and then again, much later, with the triumph of the nationalistic and romantic version of the battle in the 19th century. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it made you think a little. If you can, please subscribe, as it will help the channel a lot. If you're feeling very generous, please, as I say, buy me a coffee. The link is below. This will enable me to make more videos. Gribh míle maith, gribh go léir.